So we're nearly finished the whole book, and we're going to be starting the last chapter today. So I'm going to be reading from Acts 27:39 through to Acts 28, verse 10. Now when it was day, they did not recognize the land, but they noticed a bay with a beach, on which they planned, if possible, to run the ship ashore. It's for the benefit of those that aren't aware. Paul's been on a ship being taken to Rome, and they've sailed into a storm which has just completely baffled them and the sailors, and they've actually given up hope, and now they've been driven towards the shore. It looks like they're going to be wrecked. But Paul has actually been visited by an angel who's told them not to be afraid, that all the people on the ship will be saved. So that's the context. From verse 40. So they cast off the anchors and left them in the sea, and at the same time loosening the ropes that tied the rudders. Then hoisting the foresail to the wind, they made for the beach. But striking a reef, they ran the vessel aground, and the bow stuck and remained immovable, and the stern was being broken up by the surf. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wishing to save Paul, kept them from carrying out their plan. He ordered those who could swim to jump overboard first and make for the land, and the rest on planks or on pieces of the ship. And so it was that all were brought safely to land. Chapter 28. After we were brought safely through, we then learned that the island was called Malta. The native people showed us unusual kindness, for they kindled a fire and welcomed us all because it had begun to rain and was cold. When Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and put them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened on his hand. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to one another, "No doubt this man is a murderer. Though he escaped from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live." He, however, shook off the creature into the fire and suffered no harm. They were waiting for him to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But when they had waited a long time and saw no misfortune came to him, they changed their minds and said he was a god. Now in the neighbourhood of that place were lands belonging to the chief man of the island, named Publius, who received us and entertained us hospitably for 3 days. It happened that the father of Publius lay sick with fever and dysentery, and Paul visited him and prayed, and putting his hands on him, healed him. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and were cured. They also honoured us greatly, and when we were about to sail, they put on board whatever we needed. May Lord bless his word to us today. So, welcome to part 61 it is. We've had 61 sermons going through the book of Acts, and we're continuing here into the final chapter, chapter 28. And last time, I kind of left you all on tenterhooks, really, because the ship that Paul was on, with a total number of 276 people on board, was approaching land in the middle of the storm. And so the final countdown was on, and I didn't tell you what happened last week. So now you've all been waiting to hear this week that what happened to them. And the good news, of course, is that they all made it safely to the land. Importantly, the people had gone from abandoning all hope of being saved in 27 verse 20 to being all encouraged in verse 36 because of Paul's urging them to take heart, and because he declared to them that God had granted their lives to be saved from the storm. So they'd gone from feeling hopeless to having a sense of hope. And in many ways, Paul had gone from being the captive because he was being transported as a prisoner to Rome. He'd gone from being the captive to kind of being the captain, because people were recognizing that he represented and he spoke the word of the true and living God, and now he was their only hope of being saved. And Paul, you might remember, demonstrated his faith by giving thanks to God in the middle of the disaster, encouraging them to eat. He gave thanks in the wind and the rain. He broke bread and urged them all to eat, to give them strength for what lay ahead, because this was not going to be the end. So Paul's presence on the ship resulted in everyone being saved, because, you remember, God had decreed that Paul had to go to Rome. He had to testify before the emperor, before Caesar, about Jesus. God had decreed that this would happen. So nothing, not a storm, not the trials, not the threats to his life, nothing was going to stop him from getting to Rome. Paul had to make it. And so just by being with Paul, the others made it too. So it's kind of good to hang around an apostle if you can. It's a good thing to do. But beyond this, in this story that we have here, we read about how the prisoners, particularly on board the ship, they themselves had a second reprieve from death because of Paul. Because according to the Roman code, the Roman soldiers who were guarding their prisoners, they were accountable for the prisoners that they guarded, and their own lives would be forfeit if the prisoners escaped. So that's good motivation to make sure you guard properly your prisoner. But so as in this situation, so as not to put themselves at risk then, when the ship had run aground and was beginning to break up, the soldiers had determined to kill the prisoners before they had any chance of escape during this confusion of the wreck. And you can see that in verse, let me just go here a little bit, verse 42. The soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any should swim away and escape. But what happens is that centurion, Julius, who you might remember was quite favourable to Paul, kindly to Paul, he steps in, and with the explicit reason that he wants to save Paul, because Paul was one of the prisoners, right? If all the prisoners are going to get killed, Paul's going to be one of them. So he wanted Paul to be saved. And so he tells the soldiers not to kill the prisoners, but rather he commanded the soldiers to permit the prisoners to attempt to get to shore. So the prisoners were spared an abrupt death at the end of a Roman sword because of the favour that Paul had with Julius the centurion. You know, I would not be surprised. It doesn't say here in the Bible, but I would not be surprised to find out that ultimately Julius became a believer through Paul, because he had learned to trust and honour what Paul had said. And Luke here could see the relationship between them. I feel there's no doubt that Paul would have had a word with him and shared the gospel with him. And it looks like that Julius was the kind of guy who had ears to hear the truth. So those who could swim, swam. Those who couldn't held on to driftwood. And you know what? God did the rest. In fulfillment of his promise, verse 44 declares, so it was that all were brought safely to land. That God fulfilled his promises yet again should not be lost on us. Because here's the thing, guys. You can safely throw yourself completely overboard into the promises of God's word, and know that he's going to carry you through. Well, the land that they reached turned out to be the island of Malta. And here, as you saw, I've got a little map here which shows you the journey. Remember, they started off at Caesarea. Remember, that's where the governor's palace was, and where he'd had a bit of a trial there before Festus and Felix. And then he had been sent. They went to Sidon, then they went to Myra, which is where they changed boats. and they got onto the boat that was from Alexandria, a grain-carrying boat. It was quite a big boat. That's why I was able to take 276 people on board. Then they went to Crete, but they were sailing, of course, in October, November, which is when the weather turns in the Mediterranean and the winds increase. And this nor'easter that we hear about, even today, they're aware of the nor'easter that comes around this time of year, and it makes sailing dangerous. In fact, they're encouraged that after November, don't go out. It's too dangerous. But these guys managed to get to the island of Crete at Fair Havens, and they were hoping to get along to Phoenix, as you can see on the island there, just a little bit further. I think it was like 40 miles, about 40 miles. But unfortunately, that's when the wind came up, contrary to where they wanted to go, and it blew them way off course. And you can see it blew them right across the Mediterranean to sea, eventually to the island of Malta. Now, I was interested to read that Malta means place of honey in Greek. It was actually historically rooted to the Phoenicians, though, and in Phoenician, the same word means safe harbour. So here we have the place of honey and safe harbour. And when I say the place of honey, that might remind you of the land flowing with milk and honey. And so here, both meanings are happily relevant, because Malta, being the promised land of safety for those on a doomed ship, that's kind of good. So even the name itself starts to evoke that kind of an idea. These sorts of coincidences happen a lot in the Word of God. They happen so often that actually you begin to realise that they're not accidents. And they actually tell you that God is so sovereign, he's got these things all worked out, and he intended for this to happen. So even though it was the promised land of safety for those on the doomed ship, but for Paul, the dangers weren't completely over. And that's, of course, where we read about this peculiar story about the snake, the viper. This strange episode of a viper attacking and hanging from Paul's hand brings up the issue, when the Maltese see it, they brings up an issue of natural justice in their eyes. You can see in verse 4 there, 28 verse 4. When the native people saw the creature hanging from his hand, they said to another, "This man must be a murderer, even though he's escaped from the sea. Justice has not allowed him to live." And you might see there that the word justice is listed with a capital J. And that's because, like us, when we talk about Lady Justice, they also had a goddess of justice. And they felt that Paul had been dealt this death blow by the goddess of justice through a freakish, venomous snake bite. To have such bad luck like this, it just must be bad karma, I guess is what they're saying. He had what was coming to him even when he had escaped the perils of the sea. But Paul shakes it off into the fire. He suffers no ill effects. Indeed, the very hand that was wounded by the snake was later shown to be the same hand that actually brings healing to not only to Publius's father, but also to the people in Malta in verse 28, verse 8. But I think the presumptuousness of the Maltese is kind of amusing, isn't it? Because they jump from being certain that Paul must be a murderer worthy of condemnation to then thinking that, oh no, he must be divine himself. Of course, the more logical conclusion, I think, might have been to simply say, oh, well, no, actually, he must be innocent or under the protection of the divine, which is probably closer to the truth. Because, in some sense, Paul was seemed to be still on trial. People were talking about his justice and whether or not he was guilty or not of these crimes. But the verdict that was consistently being delivered through all these trying experiences that he had was that this man, Paul, is not guilty. In fact, he is innocent and he is faithful to God. Now, they had expected him to swell up or suddenly drop down dead because they probably recognised that particular snake and knew it to be poisonous. But he seemed to be immune from harm. Paul did. And this might be a literal example of what Jesus said to his disciples when they returned from their mission in Luke 10:19. You might remember Jesus said to the disciples when they came back, he said, "Behold, I have given you authority to tread on serpents and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing shall hurt you." And certainly, as we've pointed out, any attack against Paul, whether it was physical or whether it was demonic in its origin, none of these things could prevent him from reaching Rome and fulfilling his God-given mission. And in this sense, I think that kind of echoes a little bit of Jesus himself, because we know that, he was the one that was going to bruise the serpent's head on the cross, while the serpent could only bruise his heel. That's in Genesis 3:15, where people often say this is the first indication of the gospel, that the seed of the woman is going to bruise the head of the serpent who had deceived them into sin. But he could only bruise the heel of the one that was going to bring this crushing blow. And that serpent also was destined to perish in the fire, as it says in Revelation 20:10. So there may be some parallel there. I wouldn't want to push it too hard, but I think there's something in there that's probably worth considering. In any case, Paul had been uniquely highlighted, hadn't he, to the Maltese, within moments of them meeting him on the beach, as someone with the mark of God on his life. There was something different about him. There was something divine about him, and it was because the divine one was with him. And note the Maltese themselves. They seem to be pretty good guys, don't they? They're characterised by their kindness and their hospitality. First on the beach, providing welcome and warmth in 28:2, and then through the chief man in Malta, Publius, he gave them hospitality, lavish hospitality, it seems, for 3 days in 28:7. And then the survivors from the wrecked ship would have probably been given more permanent quarters after this, because what happened is that this is where they decided to spend the winter. They spent the winter there, so they were there for about 3 months, we find out in 28:11. The Maltese also honoured them again by giving them anything that they needed for provisions on their journey to Rome in 28:10, just before they set sail after those 3 months. So notice that these people went from having no hope of being saved in 27:20 to being honoured greatly and having whatever they needed in 28:10. So what a role reversal. You see, things can change, particularly in the grace of God. Now, Paul is misidentified as God in 28:6. They think he's God when the snake doesn't kill him. But of course, it's Jesus, isn't it? He's the one who Paul represents and who performed even greater miracles that Paul does, who is actually properly to be identified as God, as the living God himself amongst us. Now, unlike in Acts 14, you remember this is not the first time that somebody had thought that Paul was God. In Acts 14, the people in Lystra thought that Barnabas and Paul were gods come down from Mount Olympus, and they tried to worship them. Well, fortunately, that didn't happen here. The Maltese don't make any effort to worship Paul. They did, however, recognise that he had a gift of healing. And on many occasions throughout Acts, miracles provide an opportunity for witness, because they authenticate that the word being preached is really from God and not just some philosophy that some guys dreamt up and thought, oh, here's a new novel idea. Of course, Greeks were really famous for mucking around with philosophies like that. But when you have a dramatic healing which shows the finger of God is here, it brings people's attention. And it happened that here with the Maltese, which is really, really cool. There's consistency then, that miracles provide an opportunity for witness. And though it's not stated explicitly here, it's almost impossible, isn't it, to think that Paul and his companions did not witness to the Maltese. And actually, I was reading in another book that traditionally, Malta is actually full of churches. It's a very strong Christian place. And they traditionally trace their founding of the church back to this time, this moment, when Paul came in there and shared the gospel. And even Publius is mentioned as being one of their leaders of the church there. So even though he's under Roman custody and his movements are restricted, Paul continues to fulfill the Great Commission, and he's still planting churches and proclaiming the gospel. One could only assume that God intended Paul to be blessed in Malta by their hospitality, and for Paul to be a blessing to them. That biblical pattern that's in Genesis 12, that those who bless the people of God will be blessed, is manifest here. Because all Christians are blessed so that they can be a blessing. It's wrong to just sit back and enjoy God's blessing and not seek to bless your neighbours around you. And this is what Jesus tried to teach the Jews when he told them the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because someone said, "Who is my neighbour?" Your neighbour includes those on the other side of the cross-cultural fence. And we have a unique opportunity to reach out to many cultures in this multicultural society that we have, which is why we're all so excited about Nasir and his family coming from Pakistan to be with us. There's a bit of a flavour there, isn't there, of the nations being amongst us. Well, I want to move on now to talk about what I think is actually the main message that is somewhat hidden, actually, underneath this whole story of Paul and the shipwreck and the landing upon Malta. You see, I think that God is wanting us to have faith. Listen to this. I think that God is wanting us to have faith that we can be used like Paul to continue the ministry of Jesus, reaching out to people in kindness and with the message of salvation. The Holy Spirit wants you to be conscious of God being with you. And he is with you. In fact, he's in you. That you are blessed to be a blessing. Just as Paul was commissioned to continue God's work after Jesus had ascended, so now, as we're starting to come to the end of Paul's story in Acts, so the cause of reaching out and proclaiming the good news is spread out now to the other disciples to take that mantle upon themselves to carry on the work, represent Jesus and his message well. Now, we've mentioned it before, but in these last 2 chapters of Acts, there was a strong motive recalling moments of Jesus in Paul's story here. There are parallels. You might remember we mentioned it last time, of Jesus being on a boat in a storm, and with Paul being on a boat in a storm. In both cases, those on board were panicking and in fear for their lives, whilst the servant of God was at peace, knowing that the promises of God would certainly deliver them. Both stories emphasize faith in God. Do you remember Jesus said to the disciples, "You of little faith, why did you doubt?" They demonstrate that God is trustworthy and present even in the most challenging times, and even when you feel helpless and alone. I mean, think of Paul. Here he is, out in the middle of nowhere, in a storm, in a boat, by himself, but God is there with him. Paul, like Jesus, exuded faith to those around him who had little faith and who were lost in doubt. So Paul's kind of reminds us of Jesus. And Paul pretty much quotes Jesus verbatim in verse 34. Let's have a look at that. In 27, verse 34, he says, when he's promising to the crew and those on the boat that they're going to be saved, he says, "Not a hair is to perish from the head of any of you." And as soon as you read that, there's someone else who said that. That was Jesus. He said it in 2 places in Luke's Gospel, in Luke 12, 4-7, and again in Luke 21, 8. And remember that Luke is the author both of the Gospel and of this. So if he knew about what he said and he wrote about it in his Gospel, it makes sense that he might refer to it in his second book in Acts. And the context is really interesting. So in Luke 12, 4 to 7, what's Jesus doing? He's talking about who to fear in death. That physical death is one thing, but the state of your soul is actually more critical. He says, don't fear the ones who can kill the body, but fear him who can kill the body and the soul. And in Luke 21:18, Jesus is talking about being brought before kings and governors. Surprise, surprise, to bear witness, and that some would be delivered by family even unto death. And yet he says, not a hair on your head will perish. And Jesus then calls on his disciples to endure. Both of Jesus' teaching here are obviously very relevant in Paul's situation, but it's also relevant in our modern day situation. We too need to remember that there is more to life than just the life in this body, and that we each have a destiny and a call to fulfill in God's kingdom. We need to think long term, keeping our eyes on Jesus and enduring hardship in faith until our time is done and we are finally welcomed upon safe shores. And Paul also broke bread and gave thanks and ate just before facing the threat of death, which is what Jesus did as well. Just before he faced death, he broke bread and gave thanks. Even in the midst of the storm, and in this case also in the midst of desperate unbelievers, Paul focused on God, and his example brought encouragement to many. We can do that too, you know, even by simply saying grace. And I can tell you a story, and Angela will remember this. I remember we had a guy from my work. I used to work at a Bupa care home, and one of the guys from there was a friendly guy. I got on well with him, and I asked him to come and help us move into our place. Now, he was from Cyprus, and we gave him a lunch, of course, as a thank you. And I remember I wasn't sure, but I thought that he might have been a Muslim. And I was in two minds at the time whether or not I should say grace, because I didn't want to make him feel uncomfortable after helping us so much. But I decided to go ahead and do it anyway. Well, he was so impressed. Do you remember? He was so impressed. I mean, for weeks later when I saw him at work, he would just tell everyone what a good man I was, how he respected me because I took the time just to thank God for the food. It just said volumes to him. Just one little act of consistency and recognition of God's goodness spoke to him. And Paul's healing of the father of the chief man in Malta, who'd been lying down sick with fever, is another example of sort of a recall of what Jesus did. Do you remember when Jesus healed Peter's mother-in-law in Luke 4:38-41? She was also sick with a high fever. Paul demonstrates the same compassion of Jesus and his willingness to bless, despite himself having gone through traumatic experiences. And the parallel doesn't just stop there, because just as after Jesus had healed Peter's mother-in-law, what happened was that those sick with various diseases came to him and they were all healed. And that's what happens here, doesn't it, with Paul? People hear about the fact that Paul has prayed and healed Publius's father. And so what happens? People on the island brought their disease to Paul and they were cured in verse 28:9. There we go. And when this had taken place, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases also came and they were cured. Now, I think to grab hold of this passage and conclude that we should all seek the gift of physical healing and go around and expect to pray and see miracles happen instantly, I think that misses the point of what this passage is about. And Paul talks about this when he's actually talking about spiritual gifts, famously in 1 Corinthians 12:30 and into the next chapter 13:3, because he asks the question there, do all possess gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? Earnestly desire the higher gifts, and I will show you a more excellent way. And he says, if I speak in the tongues of men and of angels, but if I don't have love, I'm just a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And if I have prophetic powers and I understand all mysteries and have all knowledge and I have all faith as to remove mountains, but if I don't have love, I'm nothing. If I give away all I have and deliver up my body to be burned even, but if I don't have love, I gain nothing. The point is, of course, is to show love in action. We might all be healers. We might all be able to have that gift of healing. But we can all be healing to people in pain nonetheless, be it physical, emotional, or spiritual. I mean, just sitting with someone who is hurting can bring comfort to them. Have you done that? I've done it. I've been with someone, and I don't know what to say, but just sitting there with them meant something, and it helped them. It comforted them. You see, the heart of a servant asks, what can I do to help in this situation? I mean, I really want to help here. God, help me, use me to be of some benefit in this situation. And I think the point of all of this allusion to Jesus in Paul is actually summed up almost offhandedly. You can easily miss it in 28:3. After making it ashore, they're welcomed on the beach by the natives who kindle a fire because it's cold and raining. And Paul is collecting firewood when he gets bitten by a viper hiding in the sticks. We get easily distracted by the viper and the fact that it's dangling from his hand. I mean, I understand why we can miss it, you know. But here's the thing. Despite Paul being the key to their being saved, being the master, if you like, of their being rescued, that he is well deserving of rest and appreciation after surviving a shipwreck and struggling through the surf himself, here is Paul collecting firewood. Surely he'd already done more than his fair share through the ordeal. Shouldn't he have rather been ministered to and cared for? Shouldn't someone have just sat him down and given him a blanket and a warm cup of tea? Said, mate, you've done your bit and have a rest, Paul. But no, here's Paul driven to be a servant of all. He's asking those questions. What can I do to help in this situation? I really want to help here. He's following and copying his master, Jesus. You remember from Philippians 6, he took on the form and the mind of a servant. This brings to remembrance Jesus who washed the feet of his disciples in John 13, demonstrating that he had come to serve. Even though he was the master and Lord, he was a servant. And in Luke 22:27, Jesus says explicitly that he was among them as one who serves, in contrast to the Gentile rulers who lord it over them. Small indeed is the person who refuses to do the small jobs that need doing. Luke 17, verses 7 to 10 is an interesting passage to consider. I remember reading it and thinking, wow, that's how I need to think. Let me read it to you. Luke 17, 7 to 10. Will any one of you who has a servant ploughing or keeping sheep say to him when he has come in from the field, oh, come at once, servant, and recline at the table? Will he not rather say to him, prepare supper for me and dress properly and serve me while I eat and drink, and afterward you will eat and drink? Does he thank the servant because he did what he was commanded? So you also, when you have done all that you were commanded to do, say, we are unworthy servants. We have only done what is our duty. Because we are all unworthy servants. Because we in and of ourselves should rightfully be excluded from being in the household of God and having the privilege of serving Jesus. But because of Jesus, because of his kindness and his sacrifice, we are permitted to come in and plough his mission fields and look after his sheep and prepare a supper for him, where people from all over, from the east and the west and the north and the south, will be there to celebrate at the marriage supper of the Lamb, dressed in white robes, washed clean of sin stain. And he tells us in John 4:34-35 what kind of food he likes, you know. John 4:34-35, Jesus said to them, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work. Do you not say, there are yet 4 months and then comes the harvest? Look, I tell you, lift up your eyes and see that the fields are white, ready for harvest." He's hungry to see souls saved, for whom he's already died for them. He desires us to go and share the good news with them by having the mind and the heart of a servant, as he did, as Paul did. You see, there are people out there who are frightened and they're in real trouble. They're in the middle of a storm and they've lost all hope. Their lives have been shipwrecked. And they don't know if there's anything worth living anymore. They don't know if they're going to make it. They need to hear good news of hope and encouragement for life. They need a servant of God to come into their lives. And that is our privilege and calling, my brothers and sisters, to be servants of God, representing Jesus well, telling the news, the good news of the gospel, giving hope. And God will bring them in as we go out and proclaim the truth, which, as we said all before, the truth sets people free. Let's pray.